Well, for more on Brexit, I spoke with George Szamuely, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute of London Metropolitan University, and Klaus Larres, history and international affairs professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I first asked George if there were any regrets on the British side.
Well, remarkably, there hasn't been that much of a change in public sentiment. Many people thought that there'd be a kind of a buyer's remorse the day after the Brexit vote, but the polls have generally remained fairly steady. So it's like the British people have resigned themselves to Brexit. Whether they think that the outcome will be beneficial or not, they are resigned to it. It's as if they made their decision and now they're going to live with it. So now that, of course, may change because there's many bumps along the road. But at the moment, the voters remain fairly much the same as it was in 2016.
And Larres, what's your take? Would you say sentiment has remained the same since the Brexit vote?
I'm not quite as sure as George is. I think gradually it is dawning on the British people how negative Brexit will actually be for them, both in an economic way, but also regarding Britain's standing in the world. And I think, for example, the banking community, the finance service community, many businesses have become seriously concerned about the impact, the possible impact of Brexit. And they have actually tried to talk to Theresa May, the Prime Minister, and urged her to include the business community more into her negotiations with the Brussels community. And so far that has happened to some extent, but probably not to the extent the business community would like it to happen.
If I could just follow up on that,
Sure.
is that I agree with Klaus, but the business community was by and large, particularly the banking community, was by and large against Brexit. So in terms of has there been any shift in opinion, I'm not sure there's been much of a shift in opinion. Those who were Remainers in 2016 are Remainers now. Those who were Brexiters in 2016 are Brexiters now. So I think just in terms of whether there's been any change in sentiment, I don't think there has been.
Now, Klaus, we know that there was a lot of doomsday talk when we first saw that the Brexit vote had gone through. How has all this been impacting British businesses and those companies abroad who also have business interests in the UK?
Yeah, actually, regarding economic growth, the doom and gloom scenario hasn't become true. In fact, the UK economy is growing quite well. It is growing second only to Germany. By I think the annual growth is around about 8.8% at the moment, though inflation has really increased to 3.5% or something like that. And what people really are scared about is the future, that unemployment will rise significantly, which it hasn't done so far, but a lot of businesses will have to relocate to continental Europe, and that has already started. So I think the future, unless some trade deal is being negotiated successfully, the future doesn't look too bright, and that is what the British people are seriously concerned about. And of course, they are deeply concerned about the Irish question, which has come back with a vengeance.
And George, what about those fears from British businesses? How concerned should they be?
Well, I think at this stage, it's very hard to know because the final outcome is really very uncertain. We just don't know what the final deal will be between Britain and the EU. If there's a soft Brexit, in which case that Britain maintains its position within the EU internal market, I don't think there's any reason for them to be worried. If there's a hard Brexit, if Britain just simply walks out and there is no trade agreement and Britain doesn't have access to the EU internal market, then I think there is a real problem. So everything is really up in the air in terms of what will the final deal look like.
I would agree with that. If Britain manages to stay in the single market, as some people in Britain want, even some people in the government want, then I think prospects for the UK in an economic sense are much, much better. However, there's a severe division within the cabinet, also in the country, whether it should be a soft exit or whether it should be a hard Brexit. And I think that question needs to be resolved. If there is a hard Brexit, so no trade relationship with the EU has been agreed upon, so the UK will go back to WTO rules, then I think the doom and gloom scenario which people were afraid of initially, that may well come true. So we do need a soft Brexit, clearly.
Now, it's interesting because Prime Minister May confirmed to MPs that the UK's financial offer to the EU was conditional on the government agreeing on a final Brexit deal. Otherwise, everything could be off the table. If they cannot agree on a Brexit, then are we essentially back at square one?
Yes, essentially yes, and I think imposing conditions on on the UK's EU negotiators has already backfired. As you will have heard, that Mr. Davis, the cabinet secretary for the Brexit negotiations, has suddenly said the deal which Theresa May negotiated on the 8th of December, I think it was, that was non-binding and that might be up in the air again depending on the outcome of the final negotiations. And that has really displeased the negotiators in Brussels, and they now talk about only taking up future negotiations about a future relationship with the UK in March. And the UK had hoped that that would happen much earlier than March.
So, George, has this in fact wound back the progress then?
I don't think so, because I think that it's in everybody's interest. I think it's certainly in Britain's interest and it's in the EU's interest for there to be a soft Brexit. And I don't think anybody really wants a parting of the ways, a kind of a rough parting of the ways. So I think these kinds of problems that have arisen through what David Davis said, I think those will be resolved at the end. I mean, I think that it's just simply not in anybody's interest for there to be no deal. So so therefore, I think a lot of this is kind of a jockeying for the upcoming negotiations. But I think that ultimately there'll be, it's simply in nobody's interest for there to be no agreement between Britain and the EU.